And thank you, Pauline, for doing all the organizing. I'm so lucky to be here to meet all of you today. So I made Samuel change everything at the last minute. So I beg your forgiveness. He will get it up. I'll start with a little introduction about myself while he does that. I am one of the leads of the Google Sprint Master Academy, as Pauline said. I also lead a team called Design Relations. We are part of Developer Relations. You may have heard of Google Developer Relations. And what my team does is we support the community, designers and developers, who are building with Google's tools and platforms. So we support material design, we support design sprints, we support Android, Chrome, and what we want to do is make all of you guys successful. That's our goal with those products. And I joined Google in 2011, and I'll share a little bit about my story of why I'm here today and how I got here. You don't need the visual for it. It's just a funny little thing. Is it going to work? There you go. So my path to get here today was not a straight line. I started my career as a designer, and I started my own design studio in San Francisco a while back. And then I worked at Yahoo for 6 years as a visual designer. And while I was at Yahoo, I decided to get my master's degree in design. And I just want to share a little story with you. When I was getting my master's degree, I took a design methods class from a designer from IDEO. And I was just over the moon, excited by these methods. At the time when I was working at Yahoo, we didn't have a lot of process. Things were very fast and not very user-centered. We did not have a lot of user research. So I learned a new set of methods, and I was very excited, and I brought them back to my team at Yahoo, and I said, oh, let's try out some of these methods. This is back in 2007, and my product manager, my team, everyone said, oh, cool, we're too busy. We don't have time. I need mocks on Friday. Get them to me. So I said, okay, fine, back to making mocks. Flash forward to 2011, I joined Google as a visual designer and sadly found the same situation. Everybody there working too fast to use user-centered design methods. But then I was lucky enough to meet a woman, Nadia Derkova, who was running design sprints. And in a minute, I will take you through the history of design sprints. But she effectively changed the conversation from we don't have time to do user-centered design to we don't have time not to. This is how we're going to save time. So the design sprint methodology has enabled us to be more user-centric on these very fast timelines. It allows us to fit it in to these crazy production cycles that we have at a lot of these technology companies. So, is it working? It's okay. So for me, it changed the way I worked. And at that time, I was very frustrated. I was at Google, and people were working in the same very challenging way. I hadn't found design sprints yet, and I was ready to leave design. I was at the end. Here we go. Can we do? Okay. Oh, anyway. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'm here today because design sprints have kept me in design, and they have really changed my life. And that's why I'm here, because I'm very passionate about it. And I teach it at Google, and I run design sprints with many different kinds of companies. And so I'm happy today to share the story with you of how design sprints have evolved at Google. Our framework inside of Google is a 6-phase framework to support, okay, divergent and convergent thinking. How many of you here have read the Sprint book? Okay, Good. All right. We have a baseline of understanding. And you'll see today a variety of different approaches, some of which will have 5 phases mapped to 5 days, right? That's what the book is. Inside of Google, things are a little bit different, and we work a little differently. We utilize this framework. This is where we've started from with it. And it is... it's based on traditional UX practice. I mentioned those methods that I learned at IDEO. This framework is meant to support bringing in those traditional UX methods, some methods from business strategy, research, psychology, a lot of whatever methods, some improv. We saw improv on the list here. A number of different methods to help a team to develop an understanding of the problem space, 360-degree understanding of the problem space, and develop a hypothesis of what users will need, build deep empathy, and then develop a prototype very quickly to test with users. So that's the overview of the framework. It's okay if you leave it. I can do it without. I will survive. It's not advancing. There it is. There it is. Okay. Wait a minute. So, 2010 is when the first 5 design sprints were done at Google. Here's some fun old pictures to show you the folks who were in these design sprints. Tom Chi is one of the creators of this methodology, along with Jake Knapp. The interesting, I'll show you in a little bit, the interesting thing is Google Ventures and Google X were in the same building, and they were trying out different things together. They were looking at better ways to work because, as I mentioned, a lot of people were having trouble figuring out a good way to work. I was having trouble working with my developers and my product folks, and they were as well. So the first 5 sprints involved things like Google Glass, and some other really interesting products like Loon, things that came out of Google X. And Tom Chi, we have a great video that I recommend that you watch from our sprint conference last year, was trying to combat what he calls a guess-a-thon, where a bunch of people are making guesses. Will this work? Will this meet our users' needs? And very smart people, as this quote says, will always come up with smart reasons for their guesses. But they're still guesses. And so what we want to do is get to a place where we have real data to support our decisions and that we're not just making guesses. So that's kind of the foundation here. And here's the timeline. I mentioned 2010, Jake was started trying out what happens if we clear our calendars for 5 days, looking at, the tyranny of the 30-minute meeting. We talk very much about the tyranny of the 30-minute meeting, getting in the way of actually working well together. And in Google X, Tom was trying to get enough data quickly to make a decision on these products that he was prototyping very, very fast. At the same time, more or less in the next couple of years, we had an internal corporate engineering team that started using design sprints in their own way. And I'm going to talk through these different orgs. And the first innovation week in 2013 was when I was first introduced to this design sprint methodology. And this is when I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is so much better than how I'm working today. After that, we had our first academy in 2014, and I was one of the first graduating class, and I said, sign me up, I'll do whatever needs to be done here. And we were working towards our largest sprint ever, 175 people for our ads and commerce team. in 2014. So, and I'll talk through a little bit more of this in a minute. So you can see the trajectory. In the last couple years, we have launched a sprint conference, an external Slack channel, and our Design Sprint Kit site, which is an open source site, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. So I'm going to go through this timeline a little bit, more or less talking about how things have changed or were adapted in each of these organizations. So Google X, this is where Tom Chi was working. Nadia was also working with this team initially, and they were really optimizing for early stage ideas. They were a small team, only about 5 people. So they could clear everyone's calendars and take as much time as they needed. They didn't have to worry about asking people for time. And they had a very bottoms up culture, as we say, very flat and democratic decision making. But they also had Sergey and Larry working with them, so the decision makers were there. It was very easy for them. Google Ventures, these guys were working a little differently. They were working with startups, so also early stage ideas, also small teams that were able to clear their calendars. But they have an agency relationship with their who they're funding, their grantees. So they're on the outside. They're not in the inside of those product teams. So you can see working with them is a little bit different because they're in this agency relationship. And oftentimes they're working with a startup that has a single decider, one person who can make the decision, yes or no, we're going to do this. That's a little bit different than inside of Google. We have large teams. So ads and commerce team is one where this is where I was working. I was working on search and very complex products, very established, difficult to change, less nimble. Teams that couldn't clear their calendars for 5 days. They're not just. I wasn't just focused on one product. I was focused on 3 or 4 products. And very engineering and data driven. So we really needed the data to make decisions. But we adopted and adapted the design sprints to our needs. We were doing it a little bit differently because we were operating differently. And then corporate engineering, this is our internal team that makes all of our internal products. So how Googlers book travel, how Googlers, write expense reports. Not very sexy stuff, but very important. And this group had very limited UX resources, not a lot of designers. So they were running sprints, large sprints with maybe 1 or 2 designers and 24 people. So this was a great way for them to get more UX resources. They could leverage those 2 UXers much better in a design sprint format than as an individual working on a product. And then the other thing that's really interesting here is they did a lot of co-creation. Folks have asked me about co-creation. They're inside Google. They've got their Googlers. They can run sprints with the Googlers. So that's also very effective. So different needs. Each area optimized for those needs, for the size, for the way that their decision makers were making decisions, for the nimbleness of the product or the establishedness of the product. And I tried to figure out a good way to visualize this. When we think about different companies, different organizations, and how they work, these are the axes that we're looking at. If you are bottoms up and very small and nimble, which Google X kind of would fall in over here, you can work a different way than if you are very large and established and top down, right? So these are some of your considerations, your organization culture and size. And then also there's relationship and maturity. One of the things that we found is if you are in-house, you might work a different way because your product team might start sprinting in multiple sprints in a specific cadence to meet the needs of your product. And I love the one sprint is not enough, because it's never one sprint and you're done. There's always multiple sprints. And then you'll see what cadence of sprints you want to create or you need for your team. But if you're an agency, it's a great tool for building that rapport with the company that you're working with, helping them drive to an outcome, but you have less visibility into the actual product and the decision making. And so you're working in a different kind of relationship. I call out UX maturity as well, because if you have a highly UX mature team, this means you're very familiar with these methods. People are comfortable. It's easy to get people to do this work, and it's easy for them to understand and see where the value is going to be. If you are working in a company that doesn't have a lot of UX, isn't very mature, people have to become familiar and learn the methods in addition to the process. So in the teaching that I've done, I've seen variations in this. And even inside of Google, for example, we have teams that are not very UX mature, corporate engineering, whereas ads and commerce might have a lot of UX maturity. All right. So this is, I found this picture of myself and I had to put it up here because, as I mentioned, I was one of the first classes. And the Sprint Master Academy is where we codified this methodology. So we have these different teams working in different ways. And the ads and commerce team and Nadia came together and said, okay, now we have to teach this. If we want this to spread across this company, we're going to have to decide what this is, and we're going to have to teach it. So that's where the Sprint Master Academy came in. This original methodology that we documented looks really, really different from what's in the Sprint book. So that's the interesting thing here, is that we've optimized for these different situations inside of Google, created a methodology around it. But while this was happening, Jake was writing the book for Google Ventures. So now there's a great methodology that's been created by him for Google Ventures, but what we teach inside of Google looks different because we're a company and we've optimized it for different things. Our first curriculum was a set of 50 methods, basically. I mentioned UX methods, business strategy methods, and Sprint Masters could pick which methods they wanted. And the way in which we were ordering them was really related to game storming or the design studio process, where you're doing multiple rounds of design and iteration. We didn't have a specific length of time. My first sprint was 1 day. Nobody said to me, you have to have 5 days. It was very much around, what are your goals? Set your time period based on your goals and your deliverables. And we also were doing user testing at multiple stages throughout, not just at the end, which was very interesting. My second sprint, we did testing at the end with really rough prototypes, with sketches, paper sketches. There are downsides to that, but we were looking for that validation. We were trying to test as much as we could. And as I mentioned, sometimes very low fidelity. One of the things we found is the higher fidelity you get, the better your learnings are. So I tend to not do super low fidelity testing now, but back then we were. And we really only trained people with UX background. So to that UX maturity question, we wanted people, I knew she was going to tell me, I'm getting close. We wanted people who had a basic understanding of the methods. So we are not teaching the methods, we're teaching how do you put the methods together? How do you create your own recipes so that you can get the outcomes that you need? And we did a lot of really large sprints. 24 people was kind of normal. So in 2015, in preparation for the Sprint book coming out, I sat down with Jake and I said, okay, we have to teach one thing, right? Because the book's coming out. It's going to be a great resource for everyone. And we can't teach everything. You have to teach one thing. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed and you won't learn. So we tried to merge. This was my very difficult task. Take these different ways of working and align them to the model that Google Ventures was using. And there was a lot of challenges with this. I tried, and we came to realize that that wasn't necessary, because ultimately, each of you who runs design sprints is going to find your own way to run it anyway. So having our methodology is useful for folks. It shows you the different ways in which you can create your own approach. So some key areas of difference that we encountered when we tried to merge them were we were scoping and defining our sprints. We were spending a lot more time in preparation, because in a large company where you can't clear people's calendars, it was very hard to get people to come to the sprint unless it was scoped really well and really clearly defined. And it's very important, as you guys know, to get the right person to the sprint. So that work was really critical to making effective sprints. And we won't take 5 days if we don't need 5 days, and it's quite hard to get it. So we're really looking at what are our goals and deliverables and how much time do we need to get those, which includes validation with users. So there's a lot of math in the agendas there to figure out how you can do that. And then there's these little nuances that are related to your culture. So if you have if you notice salesmanship, people who are really good at selling things, you might, the ventures model is optimized to combat that. If you have a single decider, the Google Ventures model is optimized to make sure that decider's vote is really accurately represented. Google is a company that does not have one decider. It is very hard to have one person make that decision. So it's very democratic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there are things around reducing conversation. How much conversation do you need in your company? How much is too much? These kind of things where you might get into the nuance of how you run a method to make sure that you are basically customizing it for your culture. And one of the things that I keep encountering is that language can be really deceptive. So we have a lot of the same words in both methodologies, which will sometimes throw you off, because you can say, oh, yes, yeah, lightning tours. So for example, we have a lot of different mapping methods. The Google Ventures in the book, they've got a project map, which is a great tool. It is a very specific tool to be used in that structure, to identify a goal, to identify an audience. Sorry, whoops, going to be right there. But there are other mapping tools as well, and we in our methodology we usually use experience mapping or journey mapping, and we rely heavily on that. We don't really use the project map, though some people might find it really useful. So again, I'm not saying it's not a useful tool, but the words can be confusing because you're like, a map, are they the same thing? We're all understanding this problem in 360 degrees. That's really the core of what we're doing. And we're doing that in different ways. We happen to call our expert interviews lightning talks. They're basically the same thing. We just prepare ours all in advance, like we're doing today. We have a 10-minute lightning talk. And, we have methods for sparking creativity. Slightly different names, but it's the same thing. How do we look at this problem, in relation to other really exciting ideas out there? And the other thing is your culture, right? Loud voices and bias that gets introduced. This is a big topic, and there's lots of information out there on it. So I'm not going to touch on it too deeply, but there are different ways that you can set up your method so you can address if you have really loud voices. And I think this will probably be covered in one of the breakout sessions this afternoon in terms of how do you manage people who are either disrupting or maybe taking over. And one of the principles of a design sprint is together alone, a combination of working together and working alone. Both of those things are really valuable. It's very valuable to brainstorm together and then to spend time alone articulating your idea. Now, there are varying degrees of together alone. And so that's one of the things that we see. We do a lot more together inside of Google and a little bit less alone. So we're more merged. And we have different ways that we approach these methods. And I'm getting there. Um, and then, of course, decision making. I've called this out a couple times. There are lots of different methods for driving a decision. Ultimately, our sprint masters have to bring the group to a decision and decide what's the best way to represent that decision well. When you think about sprint disasters and stories, things where things have gone wrong, sometimes it's where you're not reflecting the decision well enough or driving the decision well enough. So that's one of those useful ones. So since the publishing of the book, and actually even earlier when we trained our first GDE Sprint Master graduates, including Pauline, we have folks outside of Google running great training programs who are helping spread this methodology and evolve it. I won't go into the details, but you can look up how some people are making modifications, changing it and customizing it for their contexts. And today, you're going to hear a lot of that as well. The other speakers are going to talk about how they're customizing for their contexts. So what's important is to think about your culture. What's your organization's culture? What's your team's culture? What are the things that you see at play? And what tools do you need? How do you want to run your methods to optimize for that culture? I was going to say, one of the things we found at Google is cross-functional collaboration has been really, really valuable for us. Some teams have a lot of cross-functional collaboration already. That's great. If you don't, the design sprint methodology can optimize for cross-functional collaboration. I like to call out my principles for design sprints. I don't propose that all of Google holds these same principles, but this is what I teach because if you take some of the other training programs, you will see they have different principles, and those principles drive how they adapt the methodology. If your principle is it's better to make something tangible than to have a conversation, then they're going to optimize for a tangible output rather than a conversation. So for me, it's always about putting the user at the center, getting that cross-functional collaboration, because when we first started running sprints at Google, it was just UX designers and researchers, no engineers and no product people. We stopped that very fast. And I believe very much in jumpstarting creativity. That means enabling people to be creative, not the opposite. And at the same time, reducing design fixation, which can happen a lot when you create something, you get attached to it. So we want to release attachment. And then getting back to that idea of making something real as fast as you can with minimal investment. And ultimately, doing is the best kind of thinking. So it's all about making it, getting it out there, and testing it. And, sorry, I'm over time. All right. Thank you. Also, just a note, the website, the Design Sprint Kit, that's an open source website that you can contribute to. If you have recipes that you run, ways that you do methods, please feel free to go contribute them. We are encouraging the variance in this methodology. All right?